After being demobbed in 1947, my father joined a very large industrial company in the northeast of England. Well, hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Rider Ramblings. Today I thought I'd give you a flavour of what life was like in the Far East, in what were the colonies, and the transition from colonial rule to true independence, travelling, and all of that. So, it's pretty chilly. I know the bike is saying 13, but it's actually about 6 or 7 degrees at the moment, so I've got the mid-season gloves on. Right, so let's say my father joined this very large international company in the northeast of England, in the very lowest position administratively, which is basically a very junior clerk. And during the day he worked, and in the evening he went to night school for about a year. After graduating from night school, he saw an advert posted on the office notice board for somebody to go and work in, I think it was Surabaya, but I'm not 100% sure. If I do remember the exact, I shall put it below. So he applied and was successful. In those days, this was what, 1947, 1948, you basically filled, or most international companies filled all their administrative positions with expatriates. And it wasn't until the early 1950s did that change. Anyhow, my father applied, got the position, and in late 1948, he travelled by ship to Indonesia. Now, the multinational companies operated very much like the military, and so you had a bachelor's mess, which was a bit like a sergeant's mess, and what this was there were quarters for the bachelors, basically a room, and then there was a communal dining room and a lounge, and the bachelors all chipped in to pay for usually 2 servants, a cook, normally called Cookie, and somebody to clean and iron and do your washing and that type of thing. It was called an armour. And my father was in Indonesia for 3 years. Now, in those days, what used to happen was you would be posted abroad for 3 years, and then you'd get 6 months leave back in the UK. This was quite simply because it took about 25 to 28 days to travel from the Far East back to the UK by ship. You have to remember that aircraft were exceptionally expensive and few and far between. So 1951 came round and my father was back in the UK, and although they didn't really know it, both my mother and father told me this, they used to go to some of the very same parties, but they didn't know each other, even though they were at the parties. After his leave in the UK, which also included having to work for a couple of days in head office, and go through a very thorough medical at the School of Tropical Medicine in London. my father returned, but this time he was posted to Singapore. And while in Singapore, he passed his driving test. Now, this, again, he was in bachelor's quarters, very similar to as I described. And he bought a car, an MGTC. It was white with red wheels. I might actually have a picture. If I have, I'll put it up. And he needed to take a driving test. My father at this point had been driving for some time, but the new rules, the new laws said you needed to take a test and have a license. So he went to the test office, which is on a hill in Singapore, which is quite rare because there's very few hills in downtown Singapore. And in front of him was a young lady who was getting into a driving instructor's car with one examiner, and my father was getting into his MGTC with another examiner. Anyhow, they sort of got settled, and the car in front started rolling backwards towards my father's beautiful MGTC. So my father sort of slammed it into reverse and quickly pulled out backwards from the parking space. Now, it was parked like these cars are here, so you had to maneuver it out. So the examiner stopped the test immediately and said, "You've passed." That was his driving test, seriously. He did actually have to take another one about 40 years later, but I might discuss that at another time. Anyhow, so this MGTC, my father liked to race this, and the Sultan of Johor, which is just across the straits from Singapore, it's literally a causeway that you cross. This was, of course, the Federated States of Malaya, so it was all colonies still, had built a nice piece of road, and part of it was deliberately built 1 mile dead straight, and this was for racing on, etc. And so most Sundays my father could be found racing his MGTC along this straight piece of road. Now, there were, of course, you know, rules and regulations, but the Sultan of Johor, being the Sultan, could do what he liked, basically, within, well, nearly what he liked. There were very few things that he couldn't do. So the racing took place. Now, of course, living out in the Far East at this time, there were quite a lot of young ladies, usually nurses, who'd come out from the UK to staff the hospitals and so on and so forth. And one of these Sundays, my father had been invited for lunch at a police station, about 30 miles or so from Johor Bahru. This would be about 1952, I think, approximately. 51, 52. So it was at the height of the Malayan emergency. You might now know what's coming. Anyhow, his girlfriend was not one who'd been a nurse, and she was in some sort of administrative position in one of the companies, and had enjoyed the racing, and they'd gone off to the police station for curry tiffin. Now, for those of you who've watched Carry On Up the Khyber, well, some of the Carry On Up the Khyber is accurate, and some of course, is complete farce. But the dinner party in sort of Carry On Up the Khyber is semi-correct. I'm not going to say it's totally correct. I'm going to say it's semi-correct. Certain things are correct, other things are total bunkum. Anyhow, they were sat down to their lunch in the police station, and the communist terrorists decided to mount a raid on the police station. Now, of course, virtually all the men, in fact all the men, had been in the military, so weapons were handed out to all the men and to some of the women, actually. Those that didn't know what they were doing were sort of told to stay under the table and keep out the way, and those that did know what they were doing were passing out ammunition and tending to any wounded if there were any. Anyhow, so they beat off the raid at the police station. Luckily there was no injuries that were reported. My father didn't specify whether anybody was injured, so that usually meant that there weren't any. He would have mentioned it otherwise. Anyhow, they handed back their weapons and sat down and continued on with their lunch. Now, my father's girlfriend, who'd not sort of done anything militarily at all, was somewhat nonplussed, and that was when he took her home that night, that was the last he saw of her. Honest, it was bye bye, I won't be, don't invite me out again. Now, the communist terrorists, you'd think, well, why didn't the 𝗲𝗟s and so on want communist terrorists? Well, basically, the 𝗲𝗟s wanted to rule themselves. They didn't want some, the Chinese or the British or anybody else to actually, govern them. So they weren't really interested in the Chinese terrorists, and also the other good thing was that the British, and mainly the SAS, had managed to keep the terrorists controlled. Now, I'm not going to say they were totally controlled, but they were, in general, kept away from the main population centres, and by about 1952, 1953, they weren't even able to get food and so on from the little villages, which in Malay are called kampong. So basically, although it did take a few years, it was about 57, 58 before the insurgents finally gave up, there were, this stopped. So that was that. Anyhow, he went on leave in 1955, another 6 months. He sailed off to the UK, and this time he met my mother and courted her. He had about 4 months in which to do so, and proposed. Now, because he'd missed his ship, he had to fly back to this time it was actually Penang. It wasn't Singapore, it was Penang. So he had to fly back to Penang. Now, this was not on a jet aeroplane, although I think the 𝗪𝗵𝗲 was available, might not have been. It was actually on a seaplane, a short Sunderland, if I remember rightly. And what happened is you used to fly during the day, land at a port at about 4 o'clock, and then you'd get off the seaplane, you'd be put up in a hotel, your luggage brought in, you'd freshen up, black tie dinner. Yeah, that's correct, it was a black tie dinner. And then in the morning you'd make sure your trunk was packed before you went for breakfast. When you came back from breakfast, your trunk, your bags had been put back on the aeroplane, and you were literally just tied it up, got your overnight bag, got back on the seaplane. You had to use the tender to be ferried out there, and you flew for another 8 hours or so, and it took about 3 or 4 days. to get out to Malaysia, to Penang. Anyhow, about 6 months later, my mother arrived by ship, by herself. Her parents decided not to come for some reason. What's going on here? This looks pretty horrid. And she stayed with some friends of my father. And they were married about 3 or 4 months later. Now, of course, she'd come out from the UK with all her usual accoutrements, so furs and that type of thing, into the Malaysian heat, which is pretty hot. You'd not be using furs out there. A bit of a prang by the looks of things. Anyhow, they got married in the cathedral in Penang, and my father gave my mother a miniature poodle as the wedding present. So that was that. I'm going to leave it there because the next bit involves terrorists again. And we'll do that next time. So please like, comment, share and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.